Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Berlin and welcome to the 4th annual conference of the Law and Development Research Network. My name is Philipp Dann and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the network and to invite you to 3 days, hopefully, of controversial and fruitful discussions about the plurality of law and development. The Law and Development Research Network, LDRN, was founded just 2 years ago, 2017, by 9 institutions from Africa, Europe, and Latin America, and has now grown into a network of 17 partner institutions from around the world. The aim of LDRN is to enhance our understanding of the role of law in relation to development and governance, and to do so by connecting researchers and practitioners from around the world. We want to help pool our knowledge to understand better the role that law plays in creating, but also in combating problems like inequality, environmental degradation, and social justice, particularly in the global south, but also through the entanglements between south and north. To achieve this goal, LDRN organizes 2 events per year, a PhD school and an annual conference. Already the first annual conference in 2017 showed a remarkable interest in the field. And this interest has only grown. For this year's conference, we received over 300 submissions from all over the world. As a result, in the coming days, more than 200 researchers and practitioners present their ideas on 55 panels. These participants hail from 39 countries, the majority of them from the global south and female. We take this massive response as an impressive manifestation of the vitality of this field. Let me say a few words now about the structure and themes of this conference before I go on to highlight 3 central concerns while we were planning this event. The basic idea of our annual conferences is simply to provide a platform. We want to give space for the huge diversity of scholars and questions in our field, and in the coming days we will meet in 8 different tracks, discussing topics ranging from gender identities and development, legal pluralism and non-state law, to public law and socio-economic development, or law and development finance. There will also be 2 more theoretical tracks. Here scholars will reflect on different, in particular interdisciplinary approaches to the field, on different histories and genealogies of research, but also on teaching and epistemology. At the same time, we continue the tradition of the annual conferences to provide space for conversations between theory and practice. There will be 4 practitioner conversations where those working in the field or in agencies provide insights into their work and its challenges. Finally, we introduce the category of book launches. But we not just want to meet in our little corners of interest, we also want to come together in the plenary. Therefore, once a day, we will have a keynote address that will provide the chance to have debates among all of us. To that end, we are truly honored to welcome Professor Katharina Pistor from Columbia Law School, who is speaking to us today, Justice Madan Lokur, a former justice of the Indian Supreme Court, speaking tomorrow, and then finally, on Friday, Professor David Trubek from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But before we start our program, I would like to use this occasion to highlight 3 special concerns that we as organizers wanted to address while planning this event. As you know, the overall theme of this conference is the plurality of law and development. And I admit that this might sound like one of those catch-all umbrella phrases elastic enough to cover almost any topic almost any presenter would like to address. Yes, it is one of those umbrella phrases, but the title also has a more programmatic meaning in that it connects to 3 particular concerns. The first concern was that we wanted to allow a big as possible plurality, not just of themes in the conference, but also of voices. We think it is imperative to pluralize our conversations and our knowledge in order to do better research and find better answers. A central path to that end is to organize truly global conversations. But such plural and global conversations all too often fail, simply because of a lack to access and resources. We therefore started an extensive fundraising tour in order to provide travel stipends for scholars from the Global South. And we are very happy to report that we were successful. The German Research Foundation, the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation provided us with generous financial support and allowed us to finance over 50 such travel stipends. Another step to pluralize the conversation lies in geography. Next year, the annual conference will take place in South Africa, which is hopefully more accessible for many scholars from the Global South. So please clear your calendar already for the next annual conference in September, late September, in Port Elizabeth in South Africa. And a third opportunity for enhancing plurality of voices is by new media. Digitalization can expand open access to scholarship and make debates more inclusive. This is why our conference is accompanied by an online symposium on the international law blog Völkerrechtsblog, and you can follow us on Twitter at LDRN 2019. Then there is a second concern while organizing this conference. We wanted not only to have more voices, but we also wanted to hear different stories of how scholarship has evolved in different countries. We think it is really important to broaden the understanding of our field by studying different histories and different experience of how law and development scholarship emerges. You might want to call this the comparative law and development perspective. I think we are all aware of one dominant story of our field, namely the one of the US academia. And there's nothing wrong with being aware of this story, on the contrary. But next to this, there are surely many other histories of writing and researching about questions of law and development in, let's say, Indonesia or Colombia, Kenya or India. Often, finding and considering these traditions might involve use a different lens. For example, looking for law and development research in India might be disappointing until one realizes that much related work there had not been done under that label, but under the label of law and poverty, or the like. So in the call for papers, we asked for these stories and experiences as entry points to pluralize our knowledge and vocabulary, and invited scholars to reflect on the history of development research. This includes, by the way, our own, the German history. So one panel tomorrow morning will deal with the German history of development research. So our first two concerns have to do with creating plurality. They appeal to alter the epistemology of our field. We want to create venues to listen to non-dominant perspectives, to engage with new voices, and simply better reflect what we know from where and from whom. But there's also a third concern. And this has to do with dealing with plurality, more concretely, dealing with the already existing plurality of scholarly communities in our field, and with the task of integrating them. As we all know, development is an impossible term for many reasons, but also a difficult term to define a field of research. Development can be everything and nothing. Not only that it is a field with relevant expertise among lawyers and economists, anthropologists and political scientists, among others. Even within the legal scholarship, there are many relevant communities that could contribute to a better understanding. But only some scholarly communities are typically identifying themselves as law and development scholars, such as those working on human rights, legal pluralism, or economic law. Other scholarly communities with relevant knowledges are mostly absent. We are thinking in particular of comparative law, which has a huge renaissance in the past years, or transnational law. Many scholars in these fields negotiate issues of development, law and development under different labels and categories, but with similar methods and sensibilities. These communities, often organized in other networks, frequently ask similar questions about law in non-Western social context, legal transplants, and the like. Thus, an important concern for us when organizing this conference was to reach out to these different scholarly communities and help integrate them into our discussions. We hope that this conference could be a place where different communities connect. I come to the end of my opening remarks. We are truly excited to have all of you here in Berlin and at our annual conference. We are grateful for your strong response and sure that we will have 3 days of intellectually stimulating and fruitful discussions ahead of us, here in the plenary, in the different panel sessions, but also over a cup of coffee in our conference lounge or on the boat cruise tomorrow evening. Again, a very warm welcome to Berlin and enjoy the conference. And now I hand over to the Dean of the Law School, Professor Martin Heger.
Thank you very much. Dear Professor Dann, dear Professor Pistor, dear Justice Locher, dear Professor Trubek, dear colleagues, dear participants of the conference, dear students. As the Dean of the Law Faculty of Humboldt University, as well as in the name of the President of Humboldt University, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome all of you to the 4th annual conference of the Law and Development Research Network. The first conference held in Berlin, Law and Development Address, the worldwide relations between legal systems all over the world in Europe and America, as well as in Africa and Asia. Some days ago, Humboldt University celebrated the 250th anniversary of Alexander von Humboldt, together with his older brother Wilhelm von Humboldt, who had founded our university more than 200 years ago. He stands still today for the traditions and the ideals of Humboldt University. Wilhelm von Humboldt, a famous lawyer and Kantian legal philosopher, as well as a Prussian Minister of Education and ambassador, created the idea of the unity of doing research and teaching, which has become the basis of nearly all modern universities all over the world, in the north as well as in the south. At the same time, Alexander von Humboldt, a mining engineer and famous natural historian, spent years in Latin America to discover the world, collect animals and plants, and published a couple of famous books on his research trips and its results. Some decades later, in the late 1840s, he gave the so-called Cosmos lectures on natural history of the world to the public of Berlin, not far away from here. With the Cosmos lectures, Alexander von Humboldt informed his auditory, the people of Berlin, not only the students of Berlin, on the miracles in the whole world. Therefore, he set the focus on the plurality of the nature and the living conditions in a lot of countries which we know today as a global south. A break. Another 40 years later, in the years 1884-85, there was another conference in Berlin, till today the so-called Berlin Conference. The aim was to divide Africa between the European states. It was another different network of European statesmen. The German Chancellor saw himself as, in German, ehrlicher Makler, an honest broker who tried to find compromises between the European powers. No one on this Berlin conference was interested in the traditions or the willing of the people who lived in the African territories. With this, today's Berlin conference, 135 years later, we have got a second chance to deal with the legal development and the relations between law and development in a totally different way. Today's Berlin is no longer only a place for the discussions between European states. Today and the next 2 days, it is the place for discussions on the plurality of law and development in all its facets and interdependencies, with actors coming from the global south, from the countries who are involved, as well as from the north, from Germany, for example, but not only from the United States, etc. Before I come to the end of my welcoming address, I want to thank Professor Dann and his team for the organization of this Berlin conference. I want to thank all the speakers and panelists for their contributions and the sponsors for the support. I wish all of you fruitful discussions and nice days in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our keynote speaker of today, Professor Katharina Pistor. Katharina Pistor is the Edwin B. Parker Professor of Comparative Law at Columbia Law School in New York City and the director of its Center on Global Legal Transformations. She is an expert in comparative corporate law and corporate governance, as well as in governing financial systems. She is the recipient of the highly esteemed Max Planck Research Award and the president of the World Interdisciplinary Network for Institutional Research. At the same time, and I hope I'm not disrespectful when I say so, Professor Pistor is perhaps not the typical card-carrying member of the law and development community. Corporate lawyers rarely are. But this is less a problem for her, I would say, than for the state of the law and development community. In fact, I would consider her in many ways a paradigmatic law and development scholar and also an ideal interlocutor for our field, for several reasons. Professor Pistor's work focuses on the role of law in economic development, in particular the role of corporate law and finance. Her work first centered on economic transformations in Eastern Europe and Asia, but over the years took on an increasingly broader and more general outlook. Her work in recent years reflects the role of law not just in regulating, but rather in constituting and constructing the fundamental categories of the capitalist economic system, such as debt, property, or legal personality. Just a few months ago, her book, The Code of Capital, was published that summarizes much of this work. Equally relevant as the substance of her work is her methodological approach. Professor Pistor studies not just the law, but also the effects of law. To that end, her research is steeped in empirical social science knowledge. She integrates and communicates intensely with the knowledge of other social sciences. Her research is therefore very often of a very immediate, pragmatic kind. Or to put it another way, in her work, theory is not an end in itself, but her theorizing emanates from a wealth of often comparative observations. And finally, there's one more dimension of her work which makes her such an important interlocutor at this very conference, and which will be, I think, partly the theme of her keynote today. And that is the function and the contribution of legal scholarship in wider debates. Given her extensive knowledge of other reservoirs of knowledge, Katharina Pistor points out where approaches and assumptions in different strands of literature connect and therefore produce interdisciplinary research might take place. So, we are particularly grateful that she can be here today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Dann, for these incredibly kind words of introduction. It's a great, great pleasure and honor for me to be here. I love to come to Berlin. It's nice to be back in the city. And I love to engage with scholars in law and development. I see some friends from Sao Paulo in Brazil here, whom I just saw a couple of weeks ago together with David Trubek in Sao Paulo on a law and development meeting. And I apologize to them because they have heard some of what I'm going to say before. I've twisted it a little bit, so maybe there's also something new. So the title of my talk is Towards Comparative Legal Institutionalism. And my aim in the paper, I'm still writing, it's a draft, it's work in progress, is really to find a synthesis in a way between these different literatures that I'm traversing all the time. Comparative law in particular, law and development, but also comparative capitalism, the law and finance literature. And so I've been sort of dabbling in between these different literatures and thinking about how to synthesize them in a way that we can harness these literatures, but in a way that has methodological consistency maybe to it. So let me just try to explain what I'm going to do here. So what I want to do is to embed these literatures in a broader scholarly endeavor in the neighboring disciplines in sociology, history, economics, political science. People have been talking about institutionalisms for some time. And for lawyers, this is sometimes a little awkward because we deal with institutions all the time. But I think that they also offer a framework, calling institutions an approach, thinking about what we have to explain institutions in broader social systems that might help us actually put these different literatures that I mentioned before into a dialogue, at least with one another, if not into a synthesis. So I want to say a few words about what institutionalisms are, the meaning of law, about comparative methodology, which I find absolutely critical. I also want to make clear that I'm including in this towards law and comparative legal institutionalism not only developing countries. I think we can use the same approach and methodology to also talk about the so-called developed countries, and we can find ways to understand under what conditions we can compare one or the other, but we don't have to categorically say this is only about the so-called developing world. And quite frankly, I just spent months in Paris and just zoomed back to the US for a weekend in New Haven and was sitting in Metro North and just thought, in terms of rail infrastructure, the US is clearly a developing country, right? We can talk about its legal system on a different occasion. Okay, so as I said before, I want to juxtapose these different other approaches that I talked about. And then at the end, I want to give you a little bit of an illustration about how I think we can apply this framework in a meaningful way. And I'm going to use a recent book by Frank Upham, who teaches at NYU Law School. The book is called The Property Fallacy and includes case studies of property reforms. And I think by using his illustrations, I hope I can show a little bit what I mean by the approach. So the aspiration of comparative legal institutionalism is to develop a theoretically grounded approach for the comparative analysis of law and legal institutions and their relationship to socioeconomic development. And I want to basically embed this in the tradition of social theories, but I also want to make clear that institutionalism as such is not a theory, but most social theories deal with institutions. So they're basically breaking them down into different components. And whether you are Marxists or even neoliberals today sort of also think about institutions, I think the approach as such can be combined with different theoretical approaches. And I want to be agnostic right now about the approaches that you may want to prefer or others will take. So I want to distinguish my approach here from a conversation I'm having with David Trubek, and we've had for quite some time, is what is law and development and how should we go about it? So in a relatively recent paper, he basically suggests that law and development has been understood as a set of ideas and practices guiding reform of legal institutions in developing and transition countries, and then even compares it to a cookbook. And I just want to say that is one way to go about it, but it's sort of this pragmatic problem-solving approach. But I think we need theoretical grounding, even for the approach that he suggests in this paper, which is basically scanning globally and then reforming locally, because what we scan and with whom we compare and who is our peer in terms of from whom can we learn must be decided before we start just taking solutions from them. And it's just not the case that just because there's another developing country out there that did something with success, another developing country can possibly learn from them. So I think we do have to have this theoretical and methodological grounding. The other point that I want to make is I want to focus on law as a particular institutionalization of state power. So there is this big debate about legal pluralism, that many other things should be called law and we should include them in the analysis. And I think we necessarily have to include other institutions in the analysis of social systems. But I also think we have to decide how we want to delineate different fields of inquiry. And as I will say in a few moments, you can start to think about this from the perspective of justice and justice theories. You might then parse the field differently. What I want to do is basically to suggest that when I talk about comparative legal institutionalism, I mean a particular institutionalization of state power. That's what we call law in the West. But I also want to expand it a little bit to have the ability to compare different types of institutionalized state power. But for my analysis, I want to understand how state power organizes societies and organizes economies. But I don't want to therefore be understood as somebody who says all the other stuff is not important, or we shouldn't call it law. That's in the end a definitional game that we're playing. I just want to explain where my focus is. So institutionalisms, of course, depending on the theories they come from, they approach this in different ways. Some focus on individual behavior, others on collective behavior, others on social structures. They also define institutions slightly differently, but I think sufficiently generally, all of them, so that we can actually say that we can create kind of a synthesis. So you're all familiar probably with Douglas North's famous definition of institutions as the humanly devised constraints on individual behavior. That's, of course, the focus of the new institutional economics approach. And then we have people like Aoki and Greif coming from a game theoretical perspective who are talking about regularized patterns of, again, individualized behavior, but they also realize that they set the norms for others who are following them. And then in historical institutionalism, Kathleen Thielen and others would talk about institutions as regularized norms guiding organizational behavior. Now, the common denominator is sort of regularized patterns of behavior, and I just want to, say, and I'm going to look at regularized patterns of behavior of organizing coercive state power. I also think that we have to talk about institutional change, understand institutional change. That we definitely need to do if we want to be pragmatic problem solvers. So we have to understand under what conditions certain institutions might change or might not change. And again, we have some work to build on, but I think this can be expanded. So, North, of course, said institutions are path-dependent. Change typically occurs through an exogenous shock. There's little said afterwards what happens after an exogenous shock. I think very often we see that institutions somehow fall back into place, but sometimes they can also be in a state of shock for too long, and then the question is, how do we not go back to these regularized patterns of behavior? Historical institutionalists actually look more closely at incremental patterns of change. So you don't need a big legislative change, you don't need a shock that sets the system into crisis, but behavioral change and interaction with institutions can produce over time enormous change if you just put this all together. She, with Wolfgang Streeck and others, has used sort of these terms of displacement, layering, drift, conversion, and exhaustion to look at this interaction between institutions and behavior that actually alters institutions. I think these approaches are quite important for what we are trying to do when we talk about law and development in general terms. So coming back to the point that I made earlier, comparative legal institutionalism basically understands law as a collective governance device that guides both individual and collective behavior. It is aspirational in the sense of trying to set also norms for others, but whether these goals are actually accomplished, of course, is an empirical question. So just because it's law and just because it has certain authority or sort of follows certain procedure doesn't mean that the outcomes are achieved. It doesn't even mean that the law is just. That is something I think that has to be inquired about and that has to be critiqued. So formal institutions they change also in different ways. They change, of course, through explicit legislative acts. But equally important are these incremental changes, that people use these law and institutions in different ways, and they also do this in different ways in different contexts. And to understand that, I think the work by Thielen and other historical institutionalists is quite important. And it's also critical to understand in this context that people can change the law incrementally without achieving explicit formal change in a highly strategic fashion. And that's what lawyers do in legal practice and in bringing about case laws. And I think we have to be mindful of that as well, maybe more mindful than the institutional historians are, who basically look at this as almost like a, not random, but sort of a sort of incremental change, sometimes talking about political actors, but legal actors are strategic players in this context as well. So the meaning of law, I said this before, I don't want to sort of go back to this formal-informal thing, really, and that has been exhausted, I think, so much, and I will therefore give you a modified version of this in a second, but let me first contrast two approaches. One approach is developed in a recent paper by Hatfield and Weingast, it's a couple of years old now, which they call What is Law, and they basically come from justice theories and say we can have law in the terms of generalized norms that actually determine expectations of an entire group that will actually then also be enforced, but in a decentralized fashion. We can have all that as long as we have an authority, but we don't necessarily need the monopolization of coercive state power for that. So law, normatively understood, can be institutionalized in a way that lacks a state. That's where they come from. Hodgson, by contrast, basically develops a Weberian approach to what law is and says it is inextricably linked to states and state power. One of the important things of what states did when they came about, they used law not only to direct what we do, but to also suppress practices that did not fit the needs or were sometimes even eroding the goals of state power, such as establishing peace. So suppressing feuds was one of the important aspects of state power, and thereby also forcing us as individuals and communities to delegate the coercive enforcement of dispute resolution to institutions. And he calls that a major social transformation. There are, of course, then normative law theories that think about sort of what is law in terms of principles of justice, whether they are sufficiently general, transparent, contestable, whether they are substantively fair or guarantee the equality before the law. So you can come to law, of course, from different perspectives. So I will take sort of more a modified Hodgson approach here, basically saying I'm interested in the institutionalization of state power. And I think what has happened in the Western nation-state models is that law has become institutionalized in an interesting fashion, especially in the context of capitalism, where it's not just a top-down vertical regulation of by the state of what individuals and groups within society do. Neither is it just sort of then a negative right that we might have in rule of law-based states against the state, so we can protect our rights and interests against the state. But one important and sometimes overlooked dimension of law is that law enables private parties to avail themselves of state power to organize their own horizontal affairs. That's critical. That's the entire body of private law. It's contract law, it's property law, it's trust law, it's corporate law. That's where my background in corporate law comes back in. That's basically what my book is all about, sort of trying to understand and helping others understand how fundamentally important it is that private parties can avail themselves of the coercive powers of the state to organize their own affairs. That, I think, is distinct in the Western tradition, and that sometimes is being transplanted elsewhere, but doesn't really work in societies that have organized the coercive powers in a different fashion. So let me just sort of draw one comparison, and that is China or Japan for much of its history. But China in particular, I think, to this day is much more hesitant about the extent to which it allows private party to avail themselves of centralized state power to organize their own affairs without state approval and close monitoring. Plus, in China, of course, many people, and Upham in his book also says, it's not really law, it's also the party, and to which I would argue, respond, the state power in China is institutionalized in a particular way, and you have to put the state and the party together. So party guidelines are another form of institutionalizing state power, and I want to basically use the word law sufficiently broadly that I can include a comparison to that. So regularized institutionalization of state power is sort of what the scope of the field that I want to analyze, and then look at exactly who's doing it, how is it being done, how important are these vertical or horizontal relations, who can avail themselves of the monopolized coercive powers of the state. So just in a two by two, it's basically in a 4x4. Since we don't have so much time, let me just not spend too much time on that. But the one point I want to make clear as well, I include in the analysis of law both just and unjust law, because we very often don't even know whether law is just or unjust until we have looked at the outcomes. It's difficult. Sometimes you can see, of course, that the law as such is substantively unjust or has been adopted in an unjust fashion, but very often the outcome can be unjust. So I take a broad approach to law. It's not entirely positivistic and procedurally. It's not only law that goes through the legislature or it's a precedent, but it's the institutionalized It's the institutionalization of coercive state powers, and whether or not it's just or not, whether or not it's effective or not, is all a question of outcome. So then I just want to spend just a few minutes on basically comparing the approach that I'm trying to develop in my paper to other approaches that I've been particularly familiar with. I don't want to say that that I've exhausted all the other approaches, but here's just a broad comparison. And in the left-hand column, you can also see the elements that I think a broader approach, a framework for comparative legal institutional analysis should be able to address. So we should be able to talk about the origins of legal institutions, the genesis questions, where do they come from? We should be able to understand processes of institutional change. We should be interested in the effects of institutions have on specific outcomes, and which outcomes these are, whether this is economic or social, should be determined by the theory that you're adopting, and the question of inquiry that you have that might vary. We should try to understand the affinity, the relationship between institutions and the broader social systems that we're analyzing, again, from perhaps different theoretical frameworks. And we have to understand the relations to public and private power wielders. Obviously, this is already a distinction, public-private, that you can problematize, but in general, I just want to make sure that when we talk about law and law development and legal institutionalism, is that we don't only focus on the state. The state makes its coercive powers available also to other players, and they can use it strategically for their own gains. I think that's the core story, actually, of capitalism. And then, of course, we want to talk about what law actually does in society, and that's where the comparison with the so-called non-law comes in, right? Sort of how important is actually this particularly form of institutionalized state power in ordering society. It just might not be very important. That's part of an inquiry, right? And we have to define what we're analyzing before we can say what is not in there. This is why I try to delineate the field in this fashion. So let me just spend a few minutes, and I might just be running through this too fast, but I also wanted to hear reactions. And since we started late, I don't want to take too much time anymore, but I want to take a few minutes to walk you through the case studies that Frank Upham has in his book and tell you how I think that fits into my framework. So we had actually, interestingly enough, I presented my paper last fall at NYU in a seminar that Kevin Davis, who's here, organized, and David Trubek was there, and Frank Upham came as well. And Frank was in the seminar and talked to me afterwards and says, what you were saying is, I think, what I just did in my book, and then gave me the book. And so nicely, he gave me the empirical case studies that I'm presenting you with here. So he looks at different episodes of property rights formation in different countries at different points in time. And I think that's in part also the power of this approach. Because what we want to do when we do comparative legal institutionalism, we want to find interesting comparative cases. And as I said earlier, it's not clear that the comparative case is always another developing country or another developed country. It could also be a historical predecessor, if we understand the institutional patterns well enough, right? And so I think his patterns of property rights have very interesting insights. They cut across the board, across also even very different geographical settings, and I'll show you how this works in a second. So his definition of law is more narrow than mine, so he's really only interested in law, or he defines law as that is passed by the normal institutions of state power that we associate with Western political systems like the legislature or the courts, and so comes to the conclusion that China doesn't really have law, but nonetheless does something very similar to the other countries. I don't really have that problem. I think we can understand the organization of state power and party power in China as another institutionalization of state power, and we'll show you how. So he talks about the enclosure of land in England in the 16th century and early 17th century in particular. He talks about legal disputes over water rights in the United States during the process of industrialization. He talks about Japan's land reform after World War II. about China's emergent property rights in multiple episodes, in multiple settings. So he talks about township and village enterprises, about foreign direct investment, urbanization, and small property rights, trying to find, actually, is there law somewhere here from his particular perspective of what is law. And he talks about land reforms in Cambodia after the civil war, when, of course, World Bank and other agencies went in and tried to reform property rights there. So I will not run you through all my sort of this classification. What you see on the left-hand side is, again, the elements that you saw before, the elements that I think an approach that wants to be comprehensive and understand institutions and legal institutions should be able to explain. And I just filled this out with this case study. So rather than running you through that, I just want to give you the common patterns that we observed over these rather disparate cases. So one of the core observations is that the formation of property rights is always a destruction of existing rights to the same assets or objects, right? So we always, when you say we reform property rights or we create new property rights, it always involves the destruction or the reallocation of rights, but also the destruction of a pre-existing regime. In most cases that he observed, from England, United States, to Cambodia and China, it's typically a reorganization, a reallocation of rights from the weak to the strong, not the other way around, with the help of law. The only exception in his case is Japan, where in a particular situation after World War II, with the backing of the United States, the occupying power, Japan was induced and somehow quasi-voluntarily, after a very lost war, embraced a land reform that reallocated lands from the elites to the tenants. It's the only exception to the rule that typically you allocate property rights from the weak to the strong. Once you have reallocated the property rights from the weak to the strong will entrench themselves very often, again, by legal means. Sometimes this can be incremental, it works through case law, but typically after we have allocated property rights, they become stabilized through, again, institutional support, very often by invoking the coercive powers of the state, and we don't see a massive transformation of these property rights for quite some time. We also see a major effect of these creation of these new property rights on economic and social outcome variables. We see some positive economic effects, typically for the new owners, but we also have the redistribution effects of those who become either landless or dispossessed. And what we find to some extent is some trickle down to the next generations because of economic progress that is achieved with the original reallocation of property rights, but it's never the same as a full equal distribution of the rewards of the change in the property rights regime, of course. There's also very strong affinity in these particular cases with capitalism and capitalist development. For England, Upham says it's been causal, and I would agree with that. Sort of the enclosure movement was one of the first major steps in the development of England's industrialization. But I also would add to that is what they also did after they achieved property rights is they were able to protect their private property rights now from their own creditors. So they wanted to have absolute property rights to also be able to control their assets, but then made sure that their own creditors wouldn't be able to take them away from them so quickly. So in a way, they brought feudalism back in through the back door using legal tools such as the entailment, as they call it in England, or a kind of trust. In the United States, the courts, as Horowitz told us decades ago, played an important role almost as development agents, right? They were very much in favor of developing doctrine in the 19th century that was pro-industrialization. So the case that he discusses is the Sanders couple that has this house on a beautiful stream of water, and then there comes a mining company upstream that pollutes the water, and they fight against that. And according to existing precedents, they should have won, and they even win in one or two cases. In the end, they get appealed because the mantra is that there's so much more value being created by the mining company that they should have the right to do so, and that everything else is kind of trivial, and so they couldn't prevent this from happening. Even in communist, so-called communist China, we see in the different episodes that Upham discusses that we have a very pro-development attitude. So economic development, of course, is a critical outcome variable for a regime that tries to maintain its grip on power and does so by incentivizing its own bureaucrats and party members to promote economic development. Those who have weaker rights lose out. In Cambodia, too, the idea of the property rights reform post-Civil War was to give land to the dispossessed, at least that was the official idea, and in fact the greatest reallocations and the formalization of property rights was in favor of development zones and development projects for foreign direct investment and economic development, which sometimes even created more dispossessed because people had to be removed from the land that was now allocated to economic development. In all of these cases, state power played a key role, but it was mediated somewhat differently. In the UK and the US, courts were critical in developing the new property rights, but also then later on in entrenching the rights of the new owners against their own creditors. In Cambodia, China, and Japan, legislative and administrative change was more important, and of course you see patterns here of the civil law versus the common law countries, so you can look at different institutionalized forms that give meaning and effectiveness to these different institutional change. And courts are, in these countries, almost weak by design, as we know from Japanese legal history. The other point, so just to summarize this, law was instrumental in bringing about change. There was what Upham says, what law achieved, and he puts this also, I think, a somewhat positive spin on it. It achieved a massive redistribution of property rights in a mostly peaceful manner. I just added the word, but it was in unjust, because it's sort of contrary to existing precedents or existing institutions, it wrestled the property rights away from some for others. But this is how he put it. He says, it enabled English society to eat its cake and have it too, to retain its sense of the sanctity of property while enjoying the rapid economic growth made possible by the destruction of the property rights of its weakest members. And this brings me to the final point. Private power played a critical role in all of these cases. So as you can see, it's always a triangulation between two different constituencies in society, to simplify it, with the state lending its coercive powers to one of the parties, and that's the party that wins, right? So it's a simple, almost vulgar Marxist story here. The only story that works differently is Japan after World War II, and it's a very unique story. The country lost the war. There was pressure by the occupying power to do something so the old elites would not be able to come back and acquire power and entrench themselves. And so for the purpose of creating a stable democracy, property rights were reallocated from the landowners to the tenants. And the courts reinforced this through case law later on, saying the purpose of all that is not economic efficiency, but democratic stability. What this also tells you is that we can have different goals for promoting institutional change. And in Japan, was not only the mantra, but I think it's people sort of have looked at that, political scientists as well, seem to agree that this was critical, one of the critical factors to create a stable democracy in Japan. The economic effects seem to be disputed. Upham in his book suggests that some people argue that therefore agricultural production was never as efficient in Japan as it was before, but in conversation he suggests that these findings are a little bit problematic. So to launch basically the debate, and I know that David will come up to the stage and we'll have a conversation about thinking in these ways about law and development, I just want to make a couple of extensions. And that goes back to the question, what is actually the value of doing all that, right? Is it just something that academics do in their ivory towers, or is there something to be gained from it? So the fundamental question is, can we do problem solving without theory, methodology, and some conscious approaches that we want to adopt? And I think perhaps we can be lucky sometimes, but I do think that Mark Gallanter and David Trubek had it right in 1974 in their article on scholars and self-estrangement, that if we don't understand theory, we don't really know what we're doing. And I think so we have to understand somehow how social systems operate and how different social systems operate, and to do so, I think we have to break them down into institutions. Do theories offer workable solutions? Well, not necessarily. Theories can be wrong, right? The whole idea of a theory is then to have it and to falsify that theory. So it could be wrong. And of course, there are many social experiments that unfortunately cost a lot of suffering, or maybe also some good things come out, but it might just be wrong. It could be badly applied as well. And it might also then identify solutions that are simply not workable. So I'm not saying we then have a blueprint when we have a theory, but maybe we have an understanding of where the bottlenecks are, where sort of the problems are that we have to solve in different societies. And most importantly, perhaps also we can sort of pick and choose the examples that we want to compare with. Can we compare Cambodia with China? Maybe not. Maybe the preconditions for that property reform in Cambodia has nothing to do with what China does. And even though both are sort of developing countries and in Asia, that's not the right comparator. But maybe Cambodia and Japan would have made sense to think about what is the goal here? Is it stable democracy, or is it rapid economic development, no matter what it means for democracy? We could have a comparison of that kind. So this is, I think, what a comparative legal institutionalist approach helps the approach that David Trubek is advocating, scan globally and reform locally, can do. Basically helping you sort of what you're supposed to scan, or which examples you may want to push aside. So whose experience matters depends on the institutional comparability of these different countries. And also, if we want to make predictions about future impact of the reforms, understanding the key players, understanding the power relations, the horizontal and the vertical, seems to be critical. Ideally, we should sort of develop a whole repository of case studies. I always take this from my husband, who is a neurologist, who says the neurologists in the old days, before they had MRIs and CTs and other things, they would observe symptoms in patients and just look at lots of symptoms and write them down and describe them. And from these cases derive inductively what happens if somebody gets shot through in the forebrain, what kind of functions in the body don't work anymore. You have a stroke on the left-hand side, the right-hand side is paralyzed, so you understand there is a connection. You know this after you've looked at enough patients. But we have to know, again, what we want to compare, and I think we have to have these descriptive, well-defined case studies with an analytical framework in mind. Okay, so let me conclude here and let's discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as already announced, so the idea was now to have David Trubek come up and give a short first comment on Katharina Pistor's presentation, and then to open up for the large discussion in the plenary. So let me briefly introduce Professor Dave Trubek, who actually doesn't need an introduction, I guess, in this group. David Trubek is formerly at least a Foss Bascom Professor of Law and Dean of International Studies Emeritus at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's also a Senior Research Fellow at the Harvard Law School. But as I said, he doesn't need much in introduction, since we are all aware of his writings. Perhaps just one thing, I think it's a remarkable feat at the same time to create a field, then to destabilize it, almost destruct it, and then recreate it and drive it on all the time. So here we go, Dave Trubek, you have the word.
So we can keep this slide, because actually this slide, I take some responsibility for this slide. So Katharina and I have been going around the world having this conversation, right? So we did it in New York, we did it in Sao Paulo, here we are in Berlin. What's next? Moscow, Beijing, Paris, we don't know. We'll keep it going. So every time I listen, this is the third time I listen and read the paper, I get something additional out of it, and I urge you to do the same when the paper is available, which I hope will be soon. Now, for those of you who may not have followed this particular discussion, in order to answer the question, what is CLI, whatever that is, relate to, SIGRL. SIGRL, now, I'm the one who came up with SIGRL. It stands for Scan Globally, Reinvent Locally. Scan Globally, Reinvent Locally. So that's really the question I want to address. I've been asking Katharina about this in many countries. But in order to understand how I got to the point of asking this question, and I will ask it again, and I hope she will answer it again, going a little further than this slide, I want to say a few words about the history of law and development, which we will also talk about on Friday. So if you look at the history, you can see that law and development was sort of originally, and for quite a while, organized around two possible meta-ideas, if I can call them that, or processes. One was the transplant idea, which was the simplest and maybe the first idea. Oh, you know, here's a developed country, they have a law like this, and here's a country that isn't quite so developed, and they don't have a law that deals with that issue, so let's copy that. And actually, having been an actual practitioner of this field, I have actually participated in exactly that, as I helped the United States government transplant the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 to Brazil. Let me point out that it didn't work, but that's another story. So that was one thing, and the other was meta-narratives, sort of the modernization, the broader modernization narrative, and then the neoliberal market narrative, which replaced it, and these were very broad narratives around which a lot was organized. And neither of those proved to be fully satisfactory, and the field moved away from that. And it moved to pragmatism, basically asking, okay, let's find out what works. It was kind of, I could call it the pragmatic turn in law and development. I think that you will see in some of the studies that are going to be discussed. For example, tomorrow we're talking about this book on bypasses. That's a beautiful example of a pragmatic study. It looks at something that works and says, look, let's understand why it works, without any sort of broad theory, but with some comparative approach. So I think we're in a time of a kind of pragmatism in the field of law and development, and pragmatism calls for ways to look at what works. And one idea, and that's where we get to, I guess you'd pronounce it SGRL, S-G-R-L. A SGRL, I never tried to pronounce it before, is to use a comparative method. So this is where comparative legal institutions meets emerging pragmatism in the field of law and development. That is, maybe we can learn what works by looking at other countries that have tried things that we in our country might be interested in, whatever it may be, providing the legal structure for privatized corporations in telecommunications, just to pick an example. Well, maybe we should look and see how other countries have done that. If we want to privatize our telecommunications, maybe we can do that. So I think that this idea that the pragmatic turn, looking for what works, which can embrace a wide variety of things, including experimentalism that Kevin Davis has written about, and looking at something like bypasses that Mariana Prados looked at, and other things. Comparative research seems to be a possible way forward in this field, which has sort of lost its faith in meta-narratives or transplants, simple transplants. So, at the same time that law and development was moving in this pragmatic way, the social sciences were discovering institutionalism. So that's the biggest move in the social scientific study of development in the last 50 years, is the move to highlight and make institutions the very center of the inquiry in development studies, I would say. You agree with that? I think that's a fair statement. And so this project, which is why I think it's so great, is an effort to bring law into that movement. And I think that's very important. And that will go on, whether it's involved developing countries or not developing countries, because that's a very broad movement. So the question is, from a law and development point of view, how we can take advantage of this development, which is an outstanding breakthrough in both in development studies and in the effort to understand where law fits in to development. Okay. Now, having said all that, I now have the questions that I want to frame for Katharina. Katharina. I'm not supposed to pronounce the H, forgive me. So here are the questions. So this is a wonderful story that Frank Upham tells about property, and it's really a great story. And anybody in law and development should learn about this. This is a book by Frank Upham. I don't know if you told the title, and I don't think you mentioned, but anyway.
Fallacy.
Huh?
The property fallacy.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's cited, but anyway, Frank Upham, NYU, Property, you'll get it. So this is a great book because it shows the role of legal change in macro developments. I mean, these are big developments, right? This is not some little thing. This is the transformation of the entire English economy, for example, just to mention something. Okay, so that's wonderful, but you know, I'm a scholar in Cape Town, and I'm thinking, yeah, but how do I do this? Within the kind of micro world that I'm living in. So I think that the first question I have for Katharina is, to the extent that we law and development scholars want to become, to adapt and develop this method or this approach, this theoretical vision, how can we bring it down to the micro level? That is the day-to-day work of everyday law and development scholarship. That's my first question. The second, the second really goes to this point about selecting peers. So if we're going to do comparative work, how can, what is the answer to the question posed in that slide? That is, how does comparative legal institutionalism help us figure out what countries to study if we're going to use a comparative method? Because that's a big question. So we once, friends of mine in Brazil and people in India, we tried to get Brazilians and Indians together to study common issues, and it didn't work very well. There were many reasons, but I think that we realized that you have to be very careful in selecting a country to compare, and I think that I'd like to hear what issues is suggested in this slide. And then the final question, I guess there are three questions. The final question is, what are the institutional requirements of comparative institutionalism? The institutional requirements of institutionalism, because institutionalism is itself an institution. That is, you need an institution to do this work. So when I first heard this speech, and I've already warned her about this, and I was going to say this, I said, gee, it sounds to me like somebody came to me and said, I figure out you could use magnetic resonance to study the interior of the body, and this would be a great diagnostic tool in medicine. And I said, yes, that's great, but how do you do it? And he would say, oh, all you have to do is build an MRI machine. Have you ever seen an MRI machine? It's this gigantic thing, costs millions of dollars, right? So the question is, and when you think about doing comparative research in several countries, developed or developing and so on, think of what Upham just sat in his in his office in the center of Manhattan and read some books, right? But if we're in the law and development business and we're working in real time and we want to do some issues that maybe people are immediately thinking about, which is not the transformation of the entire property system of a country, it may be, but it usually isn't, how do we actually do it? How do we create the institutions that could allow for genuine, comparative study of law as an institution in a way that illuminates the development issues, whatever they may be, that we at the macro level are concerned about? That's my other question.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I suggest perhaps you answer in a crisp way to Dave's question for now, but then we definitely want to open up and have questions from the audience, and we should have time to actually engage in the conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thanks for the question, and of course I was prepped a little bit for the question, so I hope I have some answers to them. How can we bring this down to the micro level? I think the institutions, focusing on institutions, is a micro level analysis, but I was trying to embed this in basically a political economy story by saying law is a particular institutionalization of coercive state power. So we have to bring power in anyhow, and we have to always do this when we try to do something at the micro level. So you basically do what doctors call a differential diagnosis. You're basically looking at a particular setting where you want to achieve particular outcomes. You're trying to understand what kind of power actually you need to achieve the reforms. You also want to basically avail yourself of some institutionalized power to achieve these reforms. Who are the veto players for this particular reform? And what are the long-term effects when you either take this measure or you take another measure? You mentioned Cape Town, and I just thought, well, for Cape Town, property rights reform should have been thought through in 1994 at the latest, and perhaps in a different way than it has been implemented. I mean, the really sad story about South Africa is that nothing really has changed for the majority of the population. And it was basically driven by a particular idea that if you basically pay compensation rather than reallocate land, then you have a more peaceful way in just giving you some money. But I think everything that we know from property rights development is that property rights, once you create them, are entrenched. People don't give them up, and giving people an equivalent in compensation is never the same as giving them assets. So I think had they sort of thought about comparative legal institutionalism at the time, I'm not sure they would have done this. It's a question of power, of course, but I think they should have done a major land reform at the time to put the country onto a different track. And I think by looking at comparative cases, Japan, for example, where it was done, other countries where some land reform was done, countries where it was not done, you can come to that conclusion. Both at the very institutional, just one little thing, maybe we're just talking about, like an urban development project in Cape Town, or the broader project of property rights in South Africa. How do we select countries to compare? Well, I think it depends on the project that we're trying to do. And I think it's not sufficient just to say another country has done the same project, but we have to find similar patterns of institutionalized power and with similar players that have availed themselves of that power to know and anticipate what the reactions might be. And how do we institutionalize that? Then finally, an MRI is great, but I think neurologists before the MRI came about used a very conservative method, because you can't just sort of cut up the brain and look inside, right? You do this indirectly by looking at the symptoms and putting them together. What we need are repositories of case studies and information, and we need analytical tools to find them. Of course, ideally, we teach our students at law schools and at econ departments to deal with these kind of case studies. We have this movement now with big data. Everybody's sort of scrambling for big data and then running them through, all kinds of regressions or finding patterns. And I'd much rather have a conservative approach first before we get lost in simply data mining. And I think having an analytical framework at your fingertips might make this more likely that you can do this. But just the last thing I want to say about how to create these institutions, I think this network is a way of creating these institutions, bringing the people together from different countries and debating these issues and talking to one another and figuring out how people have sort of not only done things but also thought about things might be a really important foundation for creating then institutional arrangements over time, regularized patterns of interacting in these kind of debates that will move us forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And this was actually an invitation to show how we think together and brainstorm together. So it's a little difficult to see. I don't know whether we can switch on the lights in the hall altogether. Who would like to? This is better. Who would like to engage? We have a microphone there, and
They're right here.
yeah, I see Mariana. So. Yeah. And we are recording this session, so please speak into the mic because then we actually record also your question. Yeah. We take first 3 questions and then go back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrin and David. I enjoyed listening to that.
Go on.
I've just got a question. You mentioned...
Sorry, could you very briefly introduce where you come from?
Yeah, I can, yeah. My name's Robin, and I've just completed doing a master's in development at IDS, Sussex, and I'm also I'm a lawyer in the UK. So I wanted to just to ask, you mentioned in terms of comparative legal institutionalism and the background to it and some of the theory that the theories of Douglas North and new institutional economics, are quite important. But what about? I mean, if we take that theory and analyze it and see that maybe it's talking about stronger property institutions leading to reduced transaction costs and leading to greater economic growth. That's kind of the basis to it. But what about other theories, for example, like Elinor Ostrom? Could you maybe speak to that for a moment? That we don't necessarily have to kind of foreground private property ownership.
Okay, thanks. Mariana?
Hi, I'm Mariana Prado. I teach at the University of Toronto. I have 2 questions. The first one is about public comparative law. And in your paper, Katharina, you account for comparative law and economics, but I missed a little bit a reference to the debate that comparative law is premised on the assumption that we can take a functional analysis of legal arrangements. So, for instance, property rights, they're highly transplantable, right? Even the idea of legal transplants assumes that there is a functionality to the legal arrangement. And some people are of the view that in public law, that functionality gets lost. So the argument here would be that it would not be possible to have comparative constitutional law, or it would not be possible to have comparative administrative law. Of course, these 2 fields are emerging now, and there is a lot of people challenging this idea, but I think there is still some kind of distinction between private and public law here that I was wondering whether you think you should account for, especially considering that you're coming from corporate law. The book by Frank you cite is property law, so we're still very much in the private law realm. Mm-hmm. And my second question, it's a bit self-promotional, but since David mentioned the bypass book, I wanted to ask how I think what Kevin, David, and I called in a previous paper meta-concepts, so I think the bypass is a meta-concept, how the potential meta-concepts can fit with your proposal of comparative institutional analysis in the following sense. The example you give from Frank, we're comparing property rights with property rights. The idea of meta-concepts allows you to compare across fields, trying to find commonalities in the structure. So I was wondering if you could talk whether you think there is room for that as well. Thank you.
You want to respond?
Sure, thank you. So first the question comparing basically or juxtaposing CLI not only with new institutional economics but also with a theory like Eleanor Ostrom's governing of common pool resources. So I think I think this goes back to what is the field of inquiry. So Ostrom studies in particular the ability of social groups to self-govern, but she also, I think, has identified after years and years and years of inductive studies and case studies everywhere and getting the data together, that the ability of societies to self-govern in this fashion has certain conditions. It works for relatively small, homogeneous groups that have a long-term horizon and share norms with one another. And I think that tells you also that beyond that, we need another form of institutionalizing governance. And basically, when I say law for me is the institutionalization of coercive state powers, I'm already a little bit outside her world, because I'm saying I'm looking at these societies where they don't have long-term horizons, they don't have maybe shared norms in the same fashion, they're not homogeneous, and they're not small. So then you just institutionalize differently. But I don't therefore mean that we should just embrace new institutional economics. I think I critique them, and particularly from a legal perspective, I critique them because I think they are overtly functional about the effects of law and don't understand really the multifacetedness of law. And I think that's a bridge to Mariana's question. So I don't think that we should even understand private law just as a functional approach. That's what the economists have done. But they don't understand first of all, the complexity of different legal institutions, whether it's property rights or contracts, right? It's an incentive structure, so incentivize people for something, but the redistributional effects of property rights, the destruction by creating something new, the way in which property rights get reconfigured through case law, it's not one static thing that once it's allocated, we just reallocate it, but it's constantly evolving within a setting of power, of institutionalized powers. We have to bring this even into the private law institutions and even more so, or to a same extent, of course, into the analysis of public law institutions. Now, I can see that we're losing something because it makes life so easy as a comparativist to be a functionalist, right? And I'm not saying we're throwing functionalism completely out of the window, but I think we have to understand the ability to strategically change the law within the legal systems by actors, and typically by actors who know how to avail themselves of coercive powers. And that's true, I think, in both settings. Finally, on the meta concept, I think the bypass is a very, very nice meta concept in the sense that you're saying we're not only doing something that is, let's say, urbanization, but it could also be traffic, reorganization, could be something else. In all of these settings, we can come and see a particular situation where we can't achieve the outcome that we want to achieve because there's so many entrenched powers. So we're basically trying to find a solution that gets around that and resets that. I think I would, so I think that is useful. I think I would just add to that we have to understand the underlying power structure to avoid, spending a lot of resources on doing a bypass and then finding out that the same actors are there and trying to block the road again, right? So I think that some of what I'm saying about the importance of embedding the institutional structure in these power relations and sort of I think would apply also to the meta concept. But I think it broadens our comparative perspective for sure.
Can I just make one slight addition? So I think that the first question, I think when institutionalism first sort of appeared in the discussion, it was linked to a rather strong neoliberal approach. And so people were a little suspicious. If they were suspicious of neoliberalism, it sort of had that connotation. I think Katharina's whole project is to get away from that bias and recenter institutionalism in a broader perspective. And I think that's very important as you try to understand this evolving project, because there is that history that has to be remembered.
Although I would add to that, at the time that the new institutional economics discovered institutions, there was already historical institutionalism, of course, political science, and there was sociological institutionalism. It was just less talked about. But I think so bringing that in is absolutely critical, and not letting them to take over the field. Yeah.
Okay, now Kevin.
I'm very soft-spoken, so I had to wait for the mic. Kevin Davis from NYU. Katharina, I guess I just wanted to ask you to address an issue that Philipp actually raised in his opening remarks about the relationship between comparative legal institutionalism and both transnational and international law. Because it seems to me that in a lot of the societies that we all work in and think about, the power relations that you're describing extend beyond the sort of territorial boundaries of the country that you're thinking about. So for example, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the Caribbean right now, and it's impossible to understand outcomes in the Caribbean without obviously taking into account what's happening in England in terms of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, but also US law on drug trafficking, immigration, firearms, and so forth, or EU law on trade and so forth. But even in the context of property rights, in a lot of countries it's hard to think about redistribution without taking into account bilateral investment treaties and their effects on the rights of investors. So this is an open-ended question, really just an invitation to expand and talk about where international/transnational law fits into your approach.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Oh, so sorry.
I would take two more and then actually wrap up. Three more questions, okay. But then I close. So Jed, and then the gentleman there, and the lady over there, and then...
Jed Cronky, University of Hong Kong. So, when I think about Frank's motivation for writing the book, right, was and partly his experience working for the World Bank in Cambodia. And when he talks about the property right fallacy, he's really like, who holds that fallacy, right, and what are the implications of this? So this is, we can have a discussion abstractly about methodology, but then there's a cultural politics, right? So there's one thing, if you go to X country and you say, like, here's the experience of the world and maybe we should have a reform, and then you go to a country like the United States and say, here's the experience of the world and we should reform our institutions based upon this. That's a very difficult conversation to have, and it creates a different incentive structure for scholars, right, to engage in the type of methodology that you're talking about. So given that these power asymmetries structure lots of things inside and outside of the academy, and that's why development is still such a powerful, public concept, because people do think places are developed and other places are not, and therefore we need different methods for talking about that. What do you see as a way for this to penetrate those who are currently sort of at the top of these power asymmetries and sort of the intellectual production internationally? And is there a real possibility for getting this type of methodology to destabilize practices in that context?
Okay, thank you.
Here, last row.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. My name is Naoki Okano. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tokyo, now based in London. My question relates to how comparative legal institutionalism and this framework relates to the idea of legal pluralism or not. And I thought about it when I heard about the three-dimensional patterns of legal ordering, where you talked about relationship between state and citizen, citizen-citizen, and citizen-state, where like three patterns exist. But after that, I kind of felt that most of the discussion regarding the first state-citizen relationship, rather than talking about this horizontal or bottom-up relationship, where when I was actually doing a PhD in land law and land governance, and where in that field that not only state-citizen relationship, but recently the contractual relationship about people, both domestically and transnationally, and also the bottom-up imagination of how loans should be governed is also becoming important. So what that kind of imagination can kick in this comparative legal institutionalism or not is my question. Thank you.
And then one final question. Behind the lady on the balcony.
In the back, yeah. In the back.
In the back. There, yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Ebele. I'm from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So I think my question is for both speakers. Specifically, what struck me was the conversation about institutional comparability of different countries. And someone who asked the question talked about power asymmetries amongst various countries, but I was specifically looking at the power asymmetries within a country that sort of form the political economy of what would constitute institutional reforms or the likelihood of a transplant to actually work or fail. So for practical purposes, I was just wondering how do comparative researchers sort of tease out these various power asymmetries in a particular political arena which is distinct and different from the power asymmetries from probably the state from which they received the transplant or transposition. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. You have the
Thank you. These are all great questions. I hope I can do justice to them. Kevin, on sort of transnational, international law, this is absolutely crucial, especially in our world. My first point is, of course, that we don't have a global state, we don't have global law, we have some international, some transnational law, but I think both the power game, even in international law itself, but also beyond national law and the transnational realm, the power game of using international private laws, we call it in Europe, or conflict of law rules, brings you again to some of the legal power centers, right? So I make this argument in my book where I say global capitalism in theory could be sustained by a single domestic system if all other countries agree to respect the legal institutions it creates and enforce them. In fact, it's sustained by two, and that's England and the state of New York, basically. That's global financial capitalism. Understanding that is critical for understanding the global world because it tells you who is creating these financial assets, who is creating globalization in that realm. There are other realms, but I think you're absolutely right. We can't understand even sovereignty in different countries anymore if we don't understand bilateral investment treaties, or we can't really understand sovereignty without understanding how sovereign debt is structured and sort of who's writing these debt contracts and what are the rights and responsibilities of the different parties in there. So I think we can trace sometimes very directly, which countries have to take foreign law and foreign currencies to be able to issue their debt. Which countries are basically, on the side where they have to sign up to these bilateral investment treaties to attract really investment, although the causal question is an open one, and which are the ones who can shop for the best investment treaty regime, put a subsidiary in the Netherlands, and from there go somewhere else. You can trace these legal institutionalized relations. They're all going back to some coercive powers because they can use a tribunal's ruling and then take the New York Convention and enforce it somewhere else, right? So, but I think the tools that I'm presenting, I think, will be applicable there as well. Jed, on the question of how to penetrate the power at the top, I think that's a really important one. But the reason I wrote my book on capitalism in the global north, really about Anglo-Saxon capitalism, is because I want to get there. And I first want to explain it and show how this works. And I think, in a way, I use the methodology that I'm talking about in this paper, in this book, to show how powerful actors have availed themselves of state power in this jurisdiction to play both domestically and globally a game that sort of benefits them more than others. Will this change? Well, I think, we are in a moment, not an inflection point yet, I'm in a moment where people are listening to these kind of arguments. All I can say, I'm being invited to talk to the Hayekians and the Chicago Business School folks and to the lefties at the same time. There is at least a debate moment right now. Will it change power? Not that fast, right? Because those who are in power, they're basically telling them the same story themselves over and over, that they have the rights and that they have the right institutions and others have the wrong institutions. And I'm trying to say that's the wrong debate to have, which I think brings us to the legal pluralism question a little bit. So I think, I don't want to be too formalistic about what is law and what is not law and how to respond to that. But I think I want to find the locus of state power, or the locus of coercive powers that you can either use top-down, but also horizontally, or bottom-up, and understand the mechanisms through which people exert that power in different societies. And as I said before, I'm trying to get away from the debate about what is formal and informal. And then finally, for practical purposes, how do we find comparability? And of course, when you really want to do something, you don't have time to have a 3-year research project to find the right comparators in history. And I'm with you on that. I think we should still do this in our academic environment. But for your purposes, I think the question is, of course, the first, have other countries done something similar before? which countries are somehow similarly situated as we are. And that's basically where the comparison starts, right? What is the framework? And not only do they have civil law or common law, I think that's probably less relevant than trying to understand who are the power players, what are the institutions, are they similar to others, to get some sense of comparability. And I think they are at the micro level, they're at the institutional level, and to be able to make predictions about whether you make a particular move that they made, would the same thing happen in your country, or are the institutions so differently situated that whatever the outcome there was is more or less unpredictable in your setting. Knowing that might not say that you will not do the reforms, but you will have a better sense of whether you're in uncharted territory. And I think what we need in all of these reforms is much more a meta-monitoring system to see where we're going, rather than thinking, okay, we do have done the institutional reforms, now things will just work. No, they won't, right? So we have to fix them, we have to recreate them, we have to reinforce them all the time, and sort of and having some sense how similar or different we are to others who have come before us would help us, I think, be alert of how much we have to do on that front.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Thank you all.